Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 457. All right, guys, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise awareness of trauma and to support new trauma therapists just starting out on their trauma-informed journey. I do that through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. If you're a therapist of any kind, interested in learning about trauma, and you're looking for support and inspiration, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, let's get started. This episode is sponsored by cptsdfoundation.org. And one of the great things about, for me, about doing this podcast is that I get to speak to and work with amazing people. And Athena Moberg, the CEO and founder of cptsdfoundation.org, is one of those individuals. This woman is on fire. I got to meet her several months ago here in San Francisco. We had breakfast together and just had a really great talk. And I got to learn about her foundation and what they're doing. They provide complex trauma survivors and practitioners with compassionate support, skills, and trauma-informed education. Athena works together with expert practitioners and treatment centers, offering daily touch points to anyone currently in trauma therapy or who wants a safe place to come, feel heard and validated between therapy appointments. Some of the resources they offer are daily recovery support, a healing book club. They have free support groups. They also offer this really cool thing where they can send you texts just to encourage you and help you heal on your journey. So check them out at cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast. Once again, that's cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Pauline Thompson. Pauline, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So Dr. Pauline Thompson is a U.S. Navy veteran who served aboard the USS Samuel Gompers in the Nuclear Repair Division during the 1988 Persian Gulf conflict. Subsequent to her service, she completed a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology at DeSales University and a PhD in psychology from Temple University. Pauline is a critical community health psychologist and is an associate professor of psychology at the Penn State Brandywine campus. For more than 20 years, she's been involved in community-based research and development with an emphasis on alternative understandings of mental health and social, emotional, and physical well-being and health. Her work spans the globe, working with refugee, migrant, and indigenous peoples, with 10 years living in New Zealand and 6 years in Australia to the USA. Pauline, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, Guy. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you.
All right. So let's start out. First of all, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you're calling from.
I'm from originally, I grew up all over the United States, mostly in the state of Pennsylvania. I went to high school in Pennsylvania.
Where'd you go? Where?
In a small town, northeast Pennsylvania called Berwick. And they have a fabulous football team. But sadly, kind of one of the things that's happened over time is that the town of Berwick has earned a reputation as being the meth capital of Pennsylvania.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I spent some time in Pennsylvania, so that's why I asked. But awesome. All right, so you're from there, and where are you calling from now?
And so where I'm at now is in Media, Pennsylvania, which is about 30 minutes west of Philadelphia at Penn State Brandywine.
Okay, awesome. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's start off. You said you have a quote. What do you have for us?
I have a quote that I think really informs a lot of the work I've done. And I'm going to give you the short version.
Okay.
And then I'd like to do the bit longer version of it.
Sure.
So it's a Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. quote. And the very brief version is, "I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism." And as you heard in my bio, I have a lot of military background. My dad was also in the Navy and came from a military family. So the militarism aspect of that has been really important to me. And I'll give you the longer version of the quote now.
Okay.
So Dr. Martin Luther King talked about creative maladjustment in a number of his speeches. And this is an extract from a speech that he gave in 1961 in Lincoln University. He says, "Every academic discipline has its technical nomenclature, and modern psychology has a word that is used probably more than any other. It is the word maladjusted. This word is the ringing cry of modern child psychology. Certainly, all of us want to live a well-adjusted life in order to avoid the neurotic personality. But I say to you, there are certain things within our social order to which I am proud to be maladjusted, and to which I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted. If you will allow the preacher and me to come out now, let me say to you that I never did intend to adjust to the evils of segregation and discrimination. I never did intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never did intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. I never did intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted, because it may well be that the salvation of our world lies in the hands of the maladjusted."
Wow, thank you for that. I've never heard that. My response to that is there are so many ways we can go with that, but why did you choose that one, Pauline?
I chose that one partly because of my own experiences, my own experiences in the military, my own experiences in so many places in society where our spirit is crushed, where our passion or our response to things that are really problematic is problematized. So I think, for example, in New Zealand, when I worked with East African refugees in New Zealand who had been fleeing civil conflict. And while they had been given a home in New Zealand, they were experiencing a lot of issues that what then we would see is people really struggling. And so you could talk about that and say, they're in a traumatic circumstance. They've been sent to a new country. They've been separated from their family. They've experienced all kinds of atrocities in their past. And now when we see behavior that does not fit in, that is not adjusted, we say, what's wrong with you? And we maybe put them in a psych ward or say, here, you need to take this medication because there's something wrong with your behavior, rather than going, no, actually, your behavior is speaking to me, is telling me that the situation that you've experienced, the life that you've lived, and the current experience that you're in is really distressing.
Mm-hmm.
So how we understand our responses to the circumstances that we're in, which is what I really appreciate in this Martin Luther King quote, is he's saying, have you heard that slaves who tried to run away would be diagnosed with a disorder? Drapetomania. Drapetomania. So if you were enslaved and you ran away, and they might catch you and say, well, you were suffering from a disorder, drapetomania, because how dare you run away?
Right.
But that response makes perfect sense.
Right.
Why would you want to stay? So I think about some of my own experiences, which really led me to doing all of this work that I had done, is when I went into the military as an 18-year-old. Went into the military because it was the only way that I was going to be able to access a college education. I was the first in my family to go to college, and this was going to be the easy way for me to get money to go to college. Joined the Navy, and not long after joining, I found myself being harassed by a supervisor. That was taken to a court martial. So at 18 years old, I was in court in a case against a supervisor. The good news in that case was that he was reprimanded very harshly. He was not a nice person. But during that process and during the court case, nobody was looking out for us young women who were involved in the case. So our care wasn't taken care of. I had, over a very short period of time, had been sexually assaulted a number of times, experiences that no 18-year-old should have to go through. And so I drank alcoholically for months, got myself into a lot of trouble.
While you're in the Navy?
While I was in the Navy.
Okay, wow.
While I was in the Navy, and their response was to put me in alcohol rehab. They said, you have a drinking problem. Let's deal with your drinking problem. So at 19 years old, I went to rehab and have not had a drink for 30 years.
Wow.
You know, and that, but when I think about this quote by Martin Luther King, and I think about the focus on my drinking as the problem, that's
Right.
the problem. That's
Right.
the behavior that we need to get under control. But my behavior was saying there's something wrong with this environment.
Yeah.
This is a problem. So I was very intrigued to learn. I'd spent my whole life focused on my recovery and as a developing person, and my spirituality and my tools to recover from alcoholism. It was only in 2015, just not that long ago, that I found myself in a situation that was very similar to that I had experienced in the military. I was essentially, metaphorically, on trial again, as I was stalked by somebody who had a romantic interest in me. And I found myself having panic attacks. And after all of these years of recovery, I was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And what I realized was that the trauma, the circumstances that had led to my drinking had never really been addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And it had all just kind of gone to sleep for a while. And it would kind of emerge every once in a while. And, you know, every once in a while, but it was kind of small enough that it didn't really matter, until I found myself in a much more difficult circumstance where my day-to-day safety felt threatened. And I realized that there had only been a Band-Aid.
Mm-hmm.
That it was only a Band-Aid on the circumstances. I had learned all of these fabulous strategies of doing great things in my life, meditating and, you know, really embracing my spirituality, and I'm a runner, and, you know, all of these tools that I have, and which I'm still a very strong advocate for. You know, but just despite the fact that I was working with people and working in context where I was really, really looking at how histories and context contribute to mental health and well-being, and compromised mental health and well-being. Despite all the work that I was doing, I hadn't recognized it even in myself.
First of all, thank you for sharing that and being so open and honest about that. I mean, that is, I think, I just really appreciate your candidness. And just going back to that quote, I mean, that, what a lens, right, to be looking through. And I so appreciate you sharing that, because I think it's just speaks volumes about how your own lens and the way you're looking at the work of mental health and the work you're doing. So let's step back a little bit, Pauline. You joined the Navy, you said, because that was the only way you can get a college degree. How did things evolve into your interest now with this work?
It's a constant learning. That's how I find it's a constant learning. All the work that I do kind of opens up whole new windows. So for example, when I worked in New Zealand, I worked mostly with refugees from East Africa, some from Iraq, Afghanistan, the Congo, and different places. And what I learned in that situation was that very specific refugee context of traumatic histories and the traumatic process of resettlement into a new country.
Mm-hmm.
And then the traumatic experience of family separation. So many women that I knew who didn't know where their children were, or who were desperately trying to get reunited with children who had been left behind. And that taught me a whole very different way of looking at things. I also did some work in New Zealand with Maori, indigenous people of New Zealand, and understanding the histories that contribute to what we might see today as trauma responses, trauma reactions, mental illness, distress, and understanding how histories of colonization can contribute to compromised well-being, and how much a sense of identity is really important. So when I moved to Australia and I was working with Aboriginal Australians in very remote communities, like it would take 2 days to get to places.
Wow.
These communities there were no paved roads to get there. And what I really felt deeply there in my understanding of well-being was the critical need for an identity. Like, who am I and how do I fit in this world and how do I make sense of that? Even so for Aboriginal people, connection to land, connection to place and space is so critical. But then I found myself going, well, how do I make sense of that?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a migrant in Australia, and who am I? So I found myself in Australia really struggling with, like I mentioned about the growing up in a town that is now called the meth capital of Pennsylvania. The opioid crisis is wiping that town out. The kids are just youth dying unnecessarily from the opioid epidemic. And I'm hearing all of that as I'm living in Australia, and I'm going, but that's my home. These are people I went to school with. These are people I know. And how do I find myself, my own identity, and figure out how I fit in the world and how that contributes to who I am, and my own well-being. And then it gets complicated when I think of my children.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I have 4 children. They were born in New Zealand. How do they make sense of their identity and who they are in the world, with an international connection? Things get complicated.
Let me just pause and reintroduce you. So I'm speaking with Dr. Pauline Thompson. She's a U.S. Navy veteran. And your book, this is the 3rd edition of the award-winning book, co-authored by yourself, Healthcare and Indigenous Australians, Cultural Safety in Practice, recently released in 2019. So let's talk a little bit about you talked about a kind of a complex evolution from, when you joined the Navy, you had that experience of harassment, to how did this interest and this book, I want to hear more about that kind of the concrete evolution of that. What did that look like where you get interested in this topic?
interested in the topic of identity and related
Yeah.
to my book. And
Yeah.
yeah, so the book is for educating health professionals in Australia to work with Aboriginal Australians, and mental health and well-being and understanding history, which a colonizing history is by definition pretty much traumatic. To be colonized as a people, to have your land taken from you. So when I was working in New Zealand, in Australia, and learning about, well, how do I teach health professionals to deliver health care in a way that is sensitive to all of that, and hopefully that sensitivity creates a safer environment for Aboriginal clients, and this should translate into better health outcomes.
All right, guys, just quickly, I want to thank Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute for being a sponsor on this podcast. Do you struggle to help numb, disconnected clients who can't feel emotion or explore inner experience? Learn a comprehensive approach to conceptualize your client's concerns. You know, as someone who's gone through the level 1 and level 2 trainings of sensorimotor psychotherapy training, I can really speak to the power of this training. For me, it was a game changer and is so inspiring. Sensorimotor psychotherapy uniquely includes the body in therapy as both a source of information and a target for intervention, because words are not enough. Go beyond theories and gain practical ways to open a new dimension for effective therapy. Visit Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute online today at sensorimotor.org. That's sensorimotor.org.
So, for example, you can think about this for any client professional service. So, our book in Australia is directed more towards healthcare professionals, but this could be social service professionals, mental health professionals, trauma therapists, as understanding when I'm interacting with someone, a big part of the cultural safety model is it's not about like, I have to know everything about you. Mm-hmm. So if you're my client, I have to know everything about you. Well, no, actually, I need to know everything about me. Mm. In order to care for you, I need to understand me. Like, who am I? Where do I come from? I think that so often in healthcare and mental health care and in training, we're taught to put this lens, this focus on our client, right, on the patient, and we're putting them under a microscope. When that interaction, that dialogue, the humanity of that interaction comes from understanding myself. That comes from, and when I dig deep here, I can care and have compassion and understanding for you, for whoever I'm coming in contact with. But I have to be mindful and reflective of who I am, because I'm not a blank slate. Right? So if I'm working with someone who culturally is so different from me, their skin color is different, their religion is different, their age is different, how do they receive who I am? Right? So when I walk in the door and someone is seeking for me to care for them, I have to think about, what are they seeing when they look at me? I have to go, oh, wait, I'm middle-aged white woman. When I was in Australia, I had to go, not only am I a middle-aged white woman, I'm American. That was a big deal. Mm-hmm. Somebody might say, well, what's that have to do with anything? Actually, it had a lot to do with things. When I worked with refugees in New Zealand, assumptions made about who I was and what my beliefs were because I was American during the Bush administration. So people would make assumptions, that she must think XYZ because she's American. Wait, what? So I have to step back and go, somebody might think these things about me. So I have to be mindful of that in how I manage this interaction. So I'll tell you a story about, actually, one of my babies was delivered not long after 9/11, and the obstetrician at the hospital who was taking care of me was an Iraqi Muslim woman. This was not long after 9/11. Here I am, a white American woman, and an Iraqi Muslim woman. I mean, the reason she's there in New Zealand is because of the disruption that the Americans have caused in Iraq. I could tell she was not very happy to have me as a patient. Right? So I've got to potentially consider, like, what is the history, what is the context, and how does that influence the interaction that I'm going to have with you? How do I set aside any biases or stereotypes that I might have? And I need to recognize them. I need to go, stop, wait a minute. Do I feel a certain way about you who just walked in the door based on how you look or what I think I know about you? I need to know that about myself, because it's potentially going to have a huge impact on the healthcare outcomes for this person I'm treating. And to think that it doesn't, but in training medical doctors would say, but I can provide good healthcare. What does that have to do with it? Everything. Because if you're prescribing medication and that person doesn't feel like they can trust you, they're just going to throw that medicine in the garbage when they walk out the door.
Let me just say something here, Pauline. I love this topic, what you're talking about here, and really, it's the essence of what this podcast is about, because it is, as you're saying and describing, it is crucial. And this idea, this topic of really the self-awareness of who the therapist is, in relation to the client, and really that serves in my mind the kind of the foundational, the earth for the healing process, right? But let me ask you this. I have so many questions on this. You're talking about this process, but were you always cognizant of that? Were you always aware of that? Or was this something that, a realization that you got to at some point? Because I love the way you framed it, because initially it's, okay, what do I need to, and when I was in graduate school and I knew I wanted to study trauma, I was exactly kind of the antithesis of what you're talking about. I was like, what do I need to learn? What do I need to, and of course you need to know stuff, but what book do I need to read? What article do I need to read that's going to help me be the best trauma therapist I could be? And I knew the importance of being authentic and genuine, but I didn't value its role within the context. So talk a little bit about your own process of getting there, that understanding.
Well, what I have to say about that is actually that it is an incredibly uncomfortable process. Because I think that most people are like you. They go, oh, but I read this book and I read that book and I've done the checklist and I got an A in that class, and so I'm really good at my job. And I learned really quickly that it doesn't work that way. And it gets really uncomfortable. I think that if you really want to be good at what you do, you have to be willing to get uncomfortable. And so in some of the things that I mean about that are, I think about being in situations where I didn't necessarily know what I was doing. I go to work on, a marae. The marae is the Maori meeting house. And I was doing a project on the marae. And, so I'm trying to do my best to learn cultural protocols and doing what I'm supposed to do. And go to the marae one day. One of the protocols is that you take your shoes off before you go in.
No,
And
sorry, let me just interject here. Are you still in the Navy at this point?
no,
Okay.
this was
Okay.
after I had finished my PhD and I was
Okay.
living in New Zealand.
Okay.
Um, so you're supposed to take your shoes off. And one day I just forgot to take my shoes off. And I went in, and the woman that I was working with, she said very nicely, she said, "You need to take your shoes off." And I was mortified. I was mortified that I had done something wrong. And, but you kind of got to get over that. Oh, wow. Okay. I screwed up. I am so sorry. But it's that little kind of thing that the other part of it, it wasn't just that I had screwed up, but screwing up in that small way was also an indication of my privilege and how I can go into a space and do whatever I want. I didn't even notice I was doing that. But that's also part of colonization, this entitlement of that, well, I can go into spaces and do whatever I want to do.
Right.
And so I had to really reflect on that and go, it's not just about screwing up. It's about, what did that screw up indicate about me and relationships and the way I interact and who I think I am, who has power in a relationship dynamic. And I need to do some work on adjusting that. So when you talked about learning all these things in your courses, we are taught often in the United States that if you get this piece of paper that says you have this degree, that you are given some legitimacy, some authority, credibility, and you have power. What if we challenged that? What if we were to go, oh, wait, actually, I know about all those books that I read, but as I was working, for example, with a Maori woman, and I realized, but I didn't know her community. I didn't know the people, the relationships, the dynamics. I had a lot to learn.
Right.
And so, as coming from a system that says, yes, but your PhD gives you all of this, and I had to get like really humble and go, actually, in this context, I need to sit back and listen. I have things that I can offer, but I need to do a lot of learning too. That's not an easy thing to do when you're taught all the way through school and everything else that you're the expert, yeah.
It's also not an easy thing to do when you're talking about the context of healthcare and specifically therapy, when most often people go into this field because they want to help, they want to help people get through pain or avoid trauma and so forth. And that is a certain perspective where you're walking into a situation and you want to fix, you want to cure. But what you're talking about that I love is you're saying, well, hold on, well, that's great. But you're saying what's important here is for you as the therapist to really kind of hone this self-awareness that is so important. And I want to say here that it's terribly challenging sometimes, specifically when you're talking about looking at, exploring, and owning our own traumas.
Yes.
Right. So wait a minute. You're saying that Pauline, you're telling, me, if I'm a therapist, that I've got to look at my own stuff?
Oh my gosh. Yes.
You talked about that before, that physician who was like, wait a minute, I know all this stuff. Why is that challenging for individuals, for all of us, a lot of us?
Well, I'm going to take it back to the Martin Luther King quote. Why? And Martin Luther King talked about capitalism, militarism, poverty as being our key issues and concerns that we need to address in our culture, in the American society. Now, how does that relate to what I'm doing as a student when I go to college and get my degree. And it's the interwoven elements of, so capitalism is about who has power and who has privilege and authority, and also about making money. If we think of individualism as being part of capitalism, so we separate ourselves from our families and communities, and that is justified through a capitalist system. You don't stay with your family if you can't get a job there, right?
Mm-hmm.
You would go, well, I have to get a job. Oh, and I got this great job opportunity that is 2,000 miles away. And we don't bat an eye at that. So we have a whole system, a whole culture that reinforces these ideas of individualism, if it's about you, and what you're doing. So as a therapist then, and particularly if you're working with clients who culturally are really different, which we often are, how do I make sense of that when, so for example, the East African communities that I worked with, very, very tight family and communities, very tight. They're not going to just pick up and move because they got a better job. Those family dynamics are critically important. We leave our family, we go, yep, that's what you do. Think about, and military reinforces that as well. So me going into the military, yep, that's what you do. You just get up and go away. That's what you're supposed to do. But we don't stop to think about how that disrupts our support networks. That, so when I think about the traumatic experiences that I had when I was in the military, I didn't have any family around. It's that way by design. By design, right? So we're destroying people.
Right.
We're breaking down our family and community connections so that I really appreciate my own therapist and therapists in general, but at the same time, I also recognize that it's really sad that I have to have a therapist. It's really sad that I have to have a therapist because I do not have the family and community networks around me, because all of those networks are constantly being under attack from individualism, capitalism, militarism, destroying the fabric of our communities. And that's what compromises our ability to manage the difficulties in the lives in life that we have anyway. Because you get sick, you have car accidents, things happen. But I'll tell you what, all that stuff is a lot harder when you don't have anybody to help you out.
No. Pauline, wow. I mean, I really appreciate this topic. I mean, it shines a light on really what I hope this podcast is about. I feel like I could talk to you for forever almost. In the interest of time here, we're going to have your book up at the show notes page. Again, that is Healthcare and Indigenous Australians, Cultural Safety and Practice. But in addition to that, any other go-to book recommendations?
You know what? I thought about that, and I have to tell you, the book that I'm going to say is a go-to recommendation. It is an old book, but this book changed my life, and it is Mr. God, This is Anna. Are you familiar with it?
No.
Highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. Mr. God, This is Anna. It's a very old book, 1970 something, I think, was when it was published by, and the author's Finn, Fynn. And it is a book about a little girl who had apparently had quite a traumatic history, and she's beautiful. She's her understanding of spirituality and Mr. God and how he is in her life, it's just a beautifully inspiring book, life-changing for me.
I love that. So, Mr. God, this is Anna by Finn, Fynn. I'll have that linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Pauline, awesome. You are kind of a bright star. I love the way you've articulated something that really has been a theme as I've been doing this podcast, and the way you've articulated it has just been really inspiring to me. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Guy, for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
All right. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
This episode is sponsored by cptsdfoundation.org. One of the great things for me about doing this podcast is that I get to speak to and work with amazing people. And Athena Moberg, the CEO and founder of cptsdfoundation.org, is one of those individuals. This woman is on fire. I got to meet her several months ago here in San Francisco. We had breakfast together and just had a really great talk. And I got to learn about her foundation and what they're doing. They provide complex trauma survivors and practitioners with compassionate support, skills, and trauma-informed education. Athena works together with expert practitioners and treatment centers, offering daily touch points to anyone currently in trauma therapy or who wants a safe place to come, feel heard and validated between therapy appointments. Some of the resources they offer are daily recovery support, a healing book club. They have free support groups. They also offer this really cool thing where they can send you texts just to encourage you and help you heal on your journey. So check them out at cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast. Once again, that's cptsdfoundation.org/trauma therapist podcast.